We've been focusing in Africa for the last few years, as Dubai being quite well known as the gateway for the Gulf region, the gateway for the Middle East, and we are positioning Dubai more and more to be the gateway of Africa. Africa being always the focus of our international activities. For the last 4 years, we've been hosting a major events here in Dubai. We call it the Global African Business Forum, and this is an annual event. We host more than 3,000 people coming from not only most of the African nations, but also we promote these events to be able to attract investors from all over the world to meet the Africans in Dubai, to be able to understand more about Africa and the business opportunities in Africa. I think one of the misconceptions many investors has with Africa, that they deal with Africa as one country. But it's very important to know that Africa is more than 50 countries. This is very key to us to raise more information about Africa, raise more information about the opportunities in Africa. Africa is the home for the world's fastest growing economies. The middle class is growing, and their consumption is growing, and they are importing a lot, and also there are more and more investments going on over there. Dubai has the close proximity to Africa. We have the infrastructure in terms of the connectivity, and this is something we've been addressing it quite well during all of the events that's happening with Africa in the past number of years.
All right, good afternoon. Now I'm going to try this again. You had a great lunch, great coffee, so good afternoon. That's more like it. We're in a very vibrant city, so I would expect, I'm sure everybody is still very energized, even though it's been a very delicious lunch. Now, my name is Medina Nagatu. I'm the managing partner for Ernst & Young in Ethiopia. I also head our transaction advisory business group. This is a great honor for me to be back. This is my third time. As I say, third time is a charmer. My role today is to sort of facilitate what I think is going to be a very exciting panel. It's about the African consumer. Now, to help me with that, I have, I'm sure you will agree with me by the time we finish with this panel, 3 fantastic people. But before I get started, I want to thank the Dubai Chamber, all the organizers for having the confidence to bring me back here. Partly it's because I'm very bullish on Dubai, have been bullish on Dubai even during the difficult times, 2008, 2009. But you can see Dubai has bounced back, right? You all agree with me. So whenever there's an opportunity to come back, I say, sure, why not? There's no hesitation on my part. Now, you've all heard about the Africa Rising narrative. I don't think I have to say anything about that. But what we want to talk about is substance. In my firm, for the last 4 or 5 years, we've been doing studies. 5 years ago, when we started our study called the Africa Attractiveness Survey, we called it It's Time for Africa, because at that time, we needed to tell the world that Africa is rising. Well, I can tell you, I do transactions, I do investment banking, I have a team that does this across Africa. Now, people don't just want to hear about Africa rising. I think everybody says, listen, Zem, we know about that. Tell us what countries, what are the risks, where is the middle class, is the bottom being lifted? They want substance. So even in our firm, we've now changed the title of our report, so we call it Getting Down to Action. And these are the 3 people who are going to help us get down to action today. First, to my left, I don't think he needs a whole lot of introduction, but he's a pioneer in the mobile business. I mean, I was just joking with him offline. First met him 15 years ago. He was definitely a pioneer, without a doubt. His name is Steve Masiwa. He's the founder of Econet, which is one of the most successful mobile banking business. We're going to talk to him about technology, how he saw the opportunities early on before anybody else, and then he will talk about other things. Next to him is Ann Cairns, who is the president of MasterCard. Both start with an M. MasterCard International. And she's going to talk to us about what are the different business models that they have, which might be different than we have, for example, in the United States or in the developed world, right? And then last but not least, we have Charles Robertson, who's written a very famous book, what's called The Fastest Billion, right? He's going to explain to us what that means. But the bottom line is we're going to have a fantastic discussion. Now, having said that, you will allow me to sit so I can fit in, partly because we have a machine, which I think all of you have an iPad in front of you. Throughout the process, we're going to be asking you to ask questions. And what we want to do is involve you in this whole discussion so that we make this interactive, and when we walk out of here, we're well informed about what is going on. But as I said, I'm going to go with the first gentleman next to me. As I said, he's a pioneer. And Strive, tell me, as I said earlier, you saw the opportunity in the mobile banking business, in the telecom business 15, 16, 17 years ago before anybody else saw that. How was that happen? What was the start? Where was it in the middle? Where is it now? And where do you think it's going? And how is that going to help the uplifting of the bottom half of the African transformation that we see in terms of the large population?
Well, thank you. As an engineer, I'm a bit concerned about the acoustics. I hope you can hear me in this place, because I could hardly hear you. Oh. The story of the African cell phone revolution is one which has been told so many times. We have over 650 million people with cell phones in Africa. That's close on 75% or so of the population. We call it penetration. Back in '94, when we were beginning to get into this industry, the actual statistic was 1.4% of the African people had a phone, let alone a cell phone. Seen in another way, 75% of the African people had never heard a telephone ringing, never mind using one. So this is one of the great revolutions, really, of all time. How entrepreneurs came together as a result of effective deregulation of a sector. That was the key thing. The monopolies had to be swept aside, the telephone monopolies, which had failed to provide service. They were mostly state-owned. They were swept aside either, as in my case, by taking them to court and breaking the monopoly, or by a more sensible approach to deregulation. But once the entrepreneurs realized that they could come in, that they could begin to provide the capital to build this sector. And they came in from everywhere. I mean, we are here in the Middle East. A lot of the major capital was mobilized here. My first trip to Dubai was 20 years ago. I can't recognize where I came. But we were talking capital. We were talking about the opportunity then. And so really, it's been an extraordinary revolution.
If I can interrupt you, though, how were you able, I mean, you said you came here 20 years ago, when mobile banking or cell phones were still in their infancy, even in the developed world. Here you are pitching an idea for investments in Africa. How were you able, I mean, because in hindsight, it seems so obvious, right? I mean, as you said today, we have 650 million plus mobile subscribers in Africa, and people say, why didn't I think about it? How were you able to show that the Africa Rising narrative 20 years ago essentially is what you've done?
It wasn't easy. To be honest with you, even it was really just about, we were zealous in our pursuit of our passion, whether it was us or people like Sawiris coming from from Egypt. Right. You know, I remember going to see him, and people thought we were crazy. But we were zealous in our passion and in our vision. But most important, you know, people talk about the mobile revolution as a communications revolution. I've always said it was not a communications revolution. Even I'm an engineer. The revolution was a financial one. It was when the prepaid, the ability for us to give access financially to people in the street who did not have a fixed address, who did not have a credit record. That little card on the street that people could scratch and put their phone in, that was the revolution. That's what made it possible. And it's inclusion for ordinary people.
Right. Just picking up on what was just mentioned here, Strive said mobile is not just for communication. MasterCard is well known for credit cards, and perhaps now for debit cards. But tell us about your business model. I know you have certain unique features and approaches in Africa compared to maybe the developed world. So why don't you tell us how you're approaching Africa compared to maybe the rest of the world?
Well, just to put it into context, MasterCard has about 2 billion cards out in the market around the world. And we know that we wanted to reach the next 500 million, the next billion consumers. So we started to think about how can we do this? And it seemed obvious to us that we had to do this by financial inclusion. And the reason is there's 2.5 billion adults on the planet today who don't have access to bank accounts, who don't have access to electronic payments. And many of those are in Africa, because Africa is 95% cash. And if you just, add up the number of people, say, in Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria, you're talking 300 million people. So we said, how can we reach these people? And our business model was developed to think about that. And we said, one of the best ways of doing that is by partnership. Let's partner with the local entrepreneurs, let's partner with the governments, and let's create a new ecosystem that reaches people in Africa. And over the last 3 years, we've been pouring investment into Africa. We've opened up 19 more countries. We put in satellite technology because we knew the infrastructure wasn't there to communicate to our network on the ground. And we've developed local partnerships, whether it's with the South African government to roll out the SASSA benefits cards using biometric solutions. We're now rolling out a pilot with the Nigerian government for their UID project, their identity project, to lay payment onto those identity cards. And the pilot is 13 million people. And of course, we're working with Strive's company, Econet, because he has created the ability for people to have cash on their mobile phone. And we've combined that with a debit card so that the same people can go and get money out of cash machines. They can go and pay for their groceries where there are point-of-sale machines. So together, we're building an integrated solution that works for Africa. And that's the business model.
So what you're saying is you have tried to adapt to the realities, both the opportunities and some of the challenges that you see in Africa by being innovative, creating certain models. I know you mentioned that the Nigerian, as that's an ID project, right? But
yes,
it can
exactly.
be used for multiple purposes.
Yes, exactly. Multiple purposes, and because Africa doesn't have some of the infrastructure of the rest of the world, Africa sometimes leapfrogs the world. We all heard about Apple Pay a couple of weeks ago. Apple Pay actually encapsulates MasterCard's technology. That's how Apple Pay works. But the thing is, Apple have gone for NFC enablement on their phones. Contactless, in other words. Now, the thing is, contactless is only single digits in America, but if you look at somewhere like Kenya, already 12.5% of the terminals are contactless. 25% will be that way before the end of this year. And the Kenyans are going to roll that out across their public transport systems, which we just did in London, by the way, 2 weeks ago. And last week, 1 million people in London took a journey by just tapping their phone or tapping their card on the London Underground. And this week, it's estimated to double. So as soon as you do that in something that's an everyday thing, then you transform whole economies.
I come to you now, Charles. As I mentioned earlier, you wrote a very famous book, but what I want to pick up is on a few specifics. When we look at Africa, there's lots of definition about the middle class. What constitutes a middle class, okay? Where I grew up in the US, we have a different definition of middle class versus what we should have in Africa, right? So the first thing I want to ask you is, how do you define the middle class? And I'll tell you why I'm asking. The African Development Bank says there are about 350 million Africans who could be classified as middle class. Now, I think Standard Bank recently came up with a different definition with a much lower figure. And I'm sure we all have our own concepts and definitions. So define for us as an economist, as someone who's written a book about this subject, what exactly is the middle class, and what is the bottom, and what is the upper in Africa?
Okay, well, there's 2 or 3 things here. First, the African Development Bank does some brilliant research. And even their study said that in Nigeria, for example, 23% of people were middle class. If you define middle class as having $2 to $20 spare a day, which I don't. $2 buys you a beer in sub-Saharan Africa and not much else. I don't think that makes you middle class. And the African Development Bank, to be fair to them, said that if you want to count just people who had $10 to $20 a day, which is what, $300, $600 a month spare, I think that's a reasonable figure for a middle class. They said that's just 4% of the Nigerian population. So I'm personally inclined to go for the 4%. But what the problem with this is the data. And what Strive was so brilliant at seeing so early was that the data for Africa does not capture the wealth in Africa. We've just seen Nigeria's GDP double this year. We used to think it was $270 billion. We now know it's $500 billion. Well, I say we know. We think it's $500 billion. That's what the statistics guys are telling us. It's way bigger than South Africa. And that change just in the definition, in the counting, is so quick that a panelist this morning still thought South Africa might be bigger than Nigeria. Nigeria is 25% bigger than South Africa now. Kenya, yesterday, or the day before, upgraded its GDP by 25%. Tanzania is going to do it by the end of this year. So what's important to me is not just that there is a vast pool of badly measured wealth, right, which some companies, like Econet, are able to capture, but also the growth in that is so fast that almost any number we use is becoming out of date within 3 to 5 years.
Can I come to Strive here? Because you collect data. I mean, as you're a mobile operator, you're in the center, let's call it data universe. Do you agree with these numbers that we see? I mean, how can you make a decision? And we talk about a lot of investors here. I do that all the time when I try to make it. I'll give you a very good example. My team and I were doing a transaction for one of the FTSE 20 companies that was doing an acquisition in the consumer space. And we're sitting, we run the numbers, Excel. At some point, because data is not easily available, you have to go with your gut instincts. You make observations, right? Now, you're more than observation because a lot of the data passes through your pipeline. So where are we in terms of the definition of the middle class? Is it $5,500 a year? Is it $15,000? Is it $20,000? And then, because then otherwise you have a misallocation of decisions and resources and time if you don't know what you're chasing. So what's your take on this?
Well, the moment I hear people talking about data and definitions, I remember something a friend of mine said, just remember, nobody eats GDP. Let me tell you an anecdotal story, if I may, in answer to your question. So the Botswana government wanted a cell phone operator. So they decided they were going to have what we call in the industry a beauty contest. So they had 5 bidders, and they hired the Swedish consultants to do the adjudication. And each one of the bidders had to make a presentation on how many customers they thought they would have in Botswana in 5 years. And we were one of the bidders. We were one of the finalists. And we had the Swedish consultants, very silver-haired, very serious experts. And I still had a bit of hair. I know you don't believe me, but I did. And so I had to go before these experts to give my assessment of the Botswana market. Population of Botswana at the time was 1.2 million. So they said to me, Mr. Masiwa, you want to tell us that there are enough people in this country for you to have 120,000 customers after 5 years. The highest number from your competitors is 30,000. So tell us, where did you get your data? I said, I checked the cows. We counted the cows. And we counted the bicycles. They looked at me. They said, you are serious? I said, well, I'm as serious as any of these other guys with their World Bank numbers. Right. I'm staying with the cows. They represent wealth in Botswana. And as long as I know the cow numbers, I'm sticking with my 120,000 subscribers.
I think that's part of the challenge, is that if you come with a mindset, we should. You see why he is a very successful businessman. He counts the cows and the sheep and the bicycles, and he reached a conclusion. The guys offshore look at Excel spreadsheets that run endlessly, and they reach their own conclusion. But I come to Anne, and I asked you the same thing, because you're obviously heavily now invested into Africa. Yes. And again, for you, it matters what that number is, what the wealth factor is, and also how you... So picking up on the cows and the bicycle example, what is your version of the definition, and how, I know we mentioned some of it up front, but how do you see that happening, the middle class coming up, the upper class coming, and the bottom? That's what we're really more focused on.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things that we think about when we're looking at a country, and actually what we're trying to do is change things one big country at a time in Africa, and that's why, as well as having partnerships with wonderful entrepreneurs who can count cows, I thought you were going to say you divide by 4, to say, because of the legs. But anyway, that we talk to governments that are interested in change, because what we say to governments is, just to count cash and move it around your country, it costs you 1.5% of your GDP. And that's not counting, your grey economy, it's not counting fraud or anything like that. But it's still a lot of money for most governments. And we talk about how to eliminate that. And if we can get the government on our side, what we try to do is link the programs that the governments are rolling out and give benefit to them. So, and we do it in a very economic way, in that South Africa, for example, had a problem with identity theft when they were giving out money to people for benefits payments, social payments. And we stepped in the middle of that and actually gave the social payments on a card, in not only saving the South African government $350 million during a 5-year period, but it's also making sure that the people who needed the money got the money. And as soon as you do that, then the local entrepreneurs step in and they create the technical environment that makes it all work. Yeah. So what we try and do is we try and work with big players who have a big scheme in mind to reach the whole population. Let's not sort of say we're going to reach that percentage or this percentage. What is it that's going to include everyone?
Right.
That's the way we're thinking. And it's not just innovation in terms of satellite technology and so on. It's innovation in terms of business model.
Right.
And that's the multi-layering that we talked about. Make something in Africa that does multiple things at once.
Right.
Because people don't just need one thing, they need everything simultaneously.
I want to bring in Charles, but before I do that, I think all of you have iPads with you, and if you can send in questions, mine is not working, so if you can send me another one. But if you can send in some questions. And second thing, there's a polling question that's preloaded on your iPads. So if you can vote, and I think the question you were asked to ask or to comment on is, which consumer good category do you expect to drive African consumer demand in the coming 5 years? I think you all have it on your computer, on your iPad. You see it there? Do you see it on your iPads, right? If you don't, it's right here. I'll repeat it again. Which consumer goods category do you expect to drive African consumer demand in the coming 5 years? Is it A, electronics, B, cars and vehicles, C, clothes and footwear, D, food products, which I think is obvious, and the final one is furniture and household. So if you can send it, we'll show you the results on the screen, but at the same time, send us in question. But I want to come to Charles. I want to talk about consumer behaviors in Africa. Do you see a pattern that is different than, say, in the developed world? Because it's also a key determining factor. Again, I'll give you an example. In a deal that we worked on, we looked at per capita consumption, or let's call it product X, which is widely available in the developed world. And we're sitting there trying to determine the value of the acquisition target of a company that produces in Africa. We're using, sorry if I'm using lingo from the investment bank, EBITDA multiples, which is earnings multiples. And you know, the buyers were very concerned that they were paying 2-3 times EBITDA for what they were paying in Europe or in the United States. But we had to kind of educate them about patterns of consumption that were slightly different. And we say you can get from very low level to what might be in middle-income countries. Do you see that? Do you see a different pattern of consumption in Africa?
Could I just ask one question of the audience first, and a really easy one? Can you put your hand up if you haven't seen Back to the Future 2? I haven't, but we all know that we are going to get levitating skateboards next year, right? That's how we're going to travel. We're not even going to bother with cars anymore because it'll be levitating skateboards. 2015 is where the star of Back to the Future went forwards to. I think predicting the future is ridiculously hard. And I think it's particularly hard when you talk about Africa because we're talking about a different generation of people. I'm way too old to be talking about what 20-year-olds are going to be doing. I'm still shocked that I can use the phone to do internet banking. In Kenya, as we've all heard many times, 30 to 40% of GDP goes through mobile money. And yet even generalizing about Africa is very dangerous. I get criticized for it, and I understand that. If you generalized about me as a European, you'd be saying I was a bit like the French, stylish and sophisticated, and I'm really not. And in Africa, you've got huge diversity. I was in Cairo yesterday. They have 0 mobile money. Only 8 to 9 people in the 84 million population have even got a bank account. You've got 40% of people now in Kenya are banked via mobile money. In Egypt, it's 10%. So massive differential, massive change between Africa being the youngest and the oldest continent in the world. Oldest physically, youngest demographically. And they are going to act more differently than I can forecast. But having said all of that, there are things that I think you can make a forecast on. Growth is on the same trajectory as India has been for the last 30 years. Sub-Saharan growth has been exactly the same for the last 30 as India for the last 30, but with a lag. And that's telling us that the economy is likely to double across Sub-Sahara every 10 years. And that means we can make a forecast on car sales. Have we got the answer yet for the car sales? For the 5 drivers, have they given us an answer?
Right.
But just to say, that's coming. That's going to be a huge driver in about 10 to 15 years. The same for air passenger numbers. And those are things we can forecast.
I think, as I said, I want to involve the audience, and they have been sending in some very good questions. Some of them are very specific to each panelist. But one of the questions, Strive, for you is, how many subscribers did you get in the first 5 years of your business, and how many subscribers do you have now?
Well, I didn't finish about the cows.
I didn't finish.
So 5 years later, in Botswana, we had 500,000 customers.
Okay.
Today, penetration in Botswana, 150%.
So you sold to the cows as well, huh?
We got to the cows. And today, though, you know, we talked of the numbers across Africa. Phenomenal. Phenomenal numbers. And I just wanted to close on that issue from what my colleague has said before I wrap up on that other question. Data is extremely important. I think when I talked about the cows, I wasn't really trying to be to make light of the matter, but it was referring to the importance of understanding the local market itself. Okay, there are international practices, but there are also local practices. I understood, for instance, that the informal sector that we're now rebasing around was real. For us as business people, we knew that, and we began to collect data around it. Today, we run entire businesses. We have a business in our company called African Data Analytics, where we have people with PhDs that are now studying algorithms to predict how people in Africa behave as consumers. For instance, we lend money. It's not just Alibaba that can lend money. We do microcredit. In 30 seconds, we can give you a loan. Okay? We don't just do that by doing this. We're doing some very serious data analytics based on mining of data on consumer behavior, that we're picking up on cell phone usage, that we're picking up on money transfer, to be able to say, yes, you may not have a pay slip, but we know you are generating, you spend maybe $200 a month, therefore we can lend you 20. So these are serious issues.
Very, very good, valid points. Do we have the results of the poll that we can show on the screen? While they pull it up, let me ask a specific question for you, Anne. How is the consumer banking changing with mobile banking products in Africa? And how will that impact the credit card? But before you answer, I think we have the results here. I forgot to bring my, I'm getting old, my glasses, but the result says 40% electronics, right? Is that a surprise to any of the panelists? B, cars and vehicles, 7%. Third is clothes and footwear, which is a bit of a surprise because isn't that one of the first things people acquire when they have additional income? As opposed to, I guess, electronics, but I guess we all want our iPhones or one of those electronic gadgets. Food is 39%, okay? Again, that does have logic to it, I agree. And furniture and household, 9%. I suppose we first eat and then we buy furniture next, right? I mean, but Anne, maybe you can pick up on this. This is an interesting result from the audience. What do you think? We spend a lot of our money, or at least the growth we think in Africa is going to come from electronics. It's because we're buying it, right? What do you make of this?
Yeah, I'm not surprised about electronics and food being the biggest driver. I mean, I guess you have to eat before you can worry about other things, but certainly, with the proliferation of mobile phones, computers, iPads, any type of pad really, I would expect those kind of results. One of the things I'd say about the future is, I think someone said it's here, it's just not evenly distributed, which I think is a great way of describing the future. And the other thing to your question that you asked Strive about speed of adoption. Right. In MasterCard, in the Middle East and Africa, it took us about, 50 years to get our first 50 million customers. It took us 3 years to get our next 50 million customers. And right now, with the kind of work that we're doing in Africa, we think that 100 million is going to double in the next 2 years. And that's really what this kind of answer is telling you, because that's what electronics does for you across these markets. It's very exciting.
And go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking that the household and furniture item I thought would have been bigger because the demographic numbers are huge. You've got a population going from 1 billion to 2 billion from 2010 to 2050. You're going to need quite a lot of furniture.
It's surprising, isn't it, that we spend, or we think the growth will come in these other sectors before furniture is for our houses. You know, I'm sure maybe he's done a very good job, obviously, convincing people that they have to have mobile phones. But
you know, one of the things that I think could change this is the Internet of Things. They say every device will become a commerce device, and we've been working with Whirlpool because you know, it's really irritating if you go into a laundrette and you don't have coins, and so we've been building a way to talk to the machines electronically. But you can see a time where, and especially in places like Africa, people won't buy washing machines. What you'll do is that the white goods firm will deliver the machine for you, and you'll just pay on a per usage basis, because it will be connected to the internet, and that will change how people actually, you know, deal with new furnishing and so on in their homes. I think that will be a different business model.
Can I pick up something also that last week I was in New York and we have another discussion like this. Today, as we discussed earlier, there are over 600 million Africans with mobile phones, most of them smartphones. I'm sure you helped do that. What essentially it means is the average African today has much information in his hand as the average American, right? How does that help sort of the growth and the transformation of African consumers and the broader African economy when you have, I mean, in the US, we used to have to go to Ivy League schools or the Library of Congress to do some deep research. Now it's there. And I recently met a professor who says one of his colleagues have 5 million students. Okay? And I said, how is that possible? It's because he teaches on the internet. So in this kind of world, I mean, where are we going with all this empowerment? Does that enable us? We have information, but are we still poor? Or does that help change our lives? I'll start with you and I'll go down the line.
Sure. You know, I was also in New York, and somebody said to President Clinton at the CGI. Clinton Global Initiative, and says, you know, a Maasai warrior today with his smartphone in his pocket has more information than you had when you were president. What do you think of that?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's extraordinary, of course. The amount of data in the world that has been processed in the world in the last 3 years is greater than all the data processed in the history of mankind. So, you know, and we're only just beginning. You know, we are working, for instance, if you ask me where my next customers are, we're trying to connect cars. Because cars and fridges and stoves, as you're going home, you know, you get an SMS from your fridge to say, please pass by the garage and pick up some milk because I don't have any milk for you. Okay? We want to monetize that. We have to. Because otherwise, the growth in our subscribers, which, as I said to you in Botswana, if you've got 150 people, I'm looking at the cows and I'm looking at, now I want to talk to the fridge. Okay? And I got to monetize it. So the other areas, of course, for me, I look at this first phase of communications that we saw really as a voice revolution. We are only just beginning the data revolution, okay? And it's going to be exciting, it's going to be incredible, it's going to touch everything, education, health, it'll all be mediated on a common platform.
But, Anne, I want to pick up on something that I see repeatedly, which is, are we trying to create a consumer base like we have in the Western world? I mean, we have lots of shortcomings of that, where people depend on credit, they live paycheck to paycheck, right? Is that the trend of the African consumer that is being created from what you see in the marketplace? Is that the way we want to go? Because in Africa, we have different cultures, we have different characters, our backgrounds are somewhat different. I mean, how do you see that developing?
No, I mean, Africa, as in many parts of the world, is evolving into a debit-based economy. You know, America, in some respects, is you know, one of the most powerful credit economy in the world. But many parts of Europe are debit-based. You know, take Holland or Germany, or and Africa's the same. I think the thing with people in Africa is understanding and feeling safe about not being able to see and touch cash, and to feel that once they put their money in a bank or a mobile phone or on a card, that money is there and it remains there until they do something with it. And it's that education, and I think this is going back to what Strive's saying about education being so important. And I think some of our previous speakers have alluded to this about, can you do something in Africa that's just purely commercial without thinking of the social side of it? And I don't think that you can. But I don't think that those two things are in conflict. I think you can do well in Africa by doing good as well. You have to think of the social aspect. And I know, you know, apart from our commercial relationship, we work together, our foundation, MasterCard Foundation, which is one of the biggest in the world because MasterCard put 10% of its stock value into our foundation. And bear in mind, we're over a 90 billion market cap company. So that's a lot of money. And that foundation works all over Africa to give secondary and tertiary education to children, and works with local companies in co-sponsorship right up to taking African children, and this is something that we do together, to Ivy League universities in America so that they get the level of education to use all the data effectively. And I think it's a very important thing to do.
And picking up on Anne's point of data, and Strave earlier said that there's a big informal sector in Africa which is undercounted, which we all know. How do you make a decision? I mean, you're in the investment banking business, you're in the advisory business, you write about economics. People like us, we tell people to part with their cash to invest in Africa. How do you help quantify that? Because in many countries, the informal sector is very large.
And that's what statistics officers have been trying to get a grip on. And that's why we're seeing such a big increase now in the GDP figures. It is attempting to estimate that informal sector. There was just a couple of things I wanted to touch on. First is the breaking down of barriers through technology is amazing. So a friend of mine was just back in Tanzania for the first time in 20 years. And the change is that 20 years ago there was no phones and no internet or anything else. Now he gets Wi-Fi on the public bus, which goes between cities, and he sits down and watches a live Arsenal game, which is a good thing to do, especially if you're in the Emirates or Africa. But you suffer. I mean, it's a hard team to follow. But nonetheless, he can do that anywhere across the continent, and it's breaking down barriers. So a Kenyan grandfather I know says that his grandson probably has more in common with a young Nigerian guy now, who listens to the same music, watches the same films, wants the same technology, than actually between the grandfather and the grandson. But there was a last point I'd love to touch on, which is education. The big question which you should be asking is this a commodity boom that's driven Africa? Is this what we've seen before in the 60s and 70s? Is it going to come to an end if commodities crash? Education is the single most important change since the 1960s and 70s. In 1975, 9% of kids in sub-Saharan Africa were at secondary school. And today it's around 30. In fact, 10 years ago it was around 30%. It's probably even higher now. And the numbers we've done says that that figure of about 30% of kids in secondary school is what is essential to take you out of rural poverty into industrialization, into a middle class. And that's the change that's happened in the last 20 years.
Again, this is a very good point, education. we going to transform Africa is not going to be just on the back of a commodity exporting continent, right? That means that's where education comes in, that's where expanding the wealth base comes in. Do you see that? Do we, as I know the heads of state earlier when they're in their panel did discuss about some of the initiatives that they've taken in the country. I know in Ethiopia, for example, college graduates now, 70% have to be in science and technology if we're going to emulate the Asian tigers. Now, we're not a big commodity exporter country to begin with anyways. We're banking our future on manufacturing, transplanting Chinese factories to Ethiopia or Nigeria or Kenya. Do you see that happening across Africa? Otherwise, this commodity super cycle, which is kind of on the decline right now because China is pulling back, is going to have a huge impact. Oil prices, a lot of commodities prices are down. Are we going to be creating jobs if we don't invest in technology? Are we going to be able to create this consumer base that we were discussing, the ones you sell to, that Anne and you talk? Tell me, how do you see that developing?
You know, if you look at our challenges, I think we have the youngest continent.
Yeah.
In our lifetimes, half the world's population, half the world's youth will be African.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge before us is how to get these kids in school, how to skill them up, to ensure that this great hope that we have of a youth dividend is realized. Mm-hmm. And the elephant in the room is education. And we're going to have to be extremely creative as well as determined. We haven't got the resources to build enough schools, to train enough teachers. Technology is going to play a key role. I believe that we can, with the technology available today, ensure that a rural child and a rural school teacher have the same access to information, education, materials. We just launched a platform today, which we call EcoSchool, where we've taken university students and we've given them all tablets. We've put all their course materials, all their books, and we are extending this now into primary schools, into secondary schools, and we aren't the only ones doing this. Mm-hmm. Okay? So they can those university students sitting in a place like Harare or Kigali will be able to access the same materials and libraries as someone sitting at Yale or MIT. Exactly. There's no reason why we can't do it. So I'm an optimist on this. It's a challenge, but we have to address it.
On that note, because we only have about a minute left, I want to give each one of you maybe, I know it's not fair, 30 seconds, but I want to ask a very specific question. One is, how do you see, if you were to look down 5 years, 10 years down the road, don't worry, I won't come to your house and hold you accountable, but if you were to forecast the future of the African consumer, the African economy, say 5 years, 10 years down the road, what would it be like? You have 30 seconds.
Okay. Well, certainly from our point of view, we think that we're going to see another at least 300 million Africans 5 years ahead included in the financial system. And we think that that kind of inclusion is going to fuel growth internally on the ground as well as from an export point of view. Mm-hmm. And we see more Africans being educated abroad returning to Africa as more Chinese do to China and more Indians do to India to actually develop the environment to be, you know, a vibrant set of economies.
I completely agree with you on the diaspora, like myself returning to Africa. Now coming to Charles. what is your forecast? And this is what you do for a living, so give me a snappy 30-second synopsis.
Simple forecast is Africa's GDP is doubling from $2 trillion to $4 trillion over the course of 10 years. But we actually did at Renaissance Capital, we did a survey of the middle class in Nigeria in 2011. I was just looking at what people answered. They said, why are you saving money? 83% in the event of an emergency, 41% to deal with day-to-day needs, and 29%, the third most important category, saving for the children's education. Now, I think that will change over the next 5 to 10 years. The emergency funding becomes slightly less necessary because people will have large enough savings, and there will still be a massive priority on education.
Very good. That was a very nice summary. I want to thank you all for having a great panel today. I know we've run out of time. We could have discussed this for another hour, but please, let's give them one round of warm applause. Now, before you all disperse, I've been told that the next panel will start in 5 minutes, so we want you to be back here. I think we have Mr. Tony Fernandez on the next panel, which I'm sure is going to be very exciting. But thank you for being here. It was an exciting panel. It ended on a very positive note. I agree with you. The Africa Rising narrative was brought alive by 3 fantastic panelists, and I'm sure you learned a lot about the African consumer, the growth that we expect. And the bottom line is, for those of you who are interested in investing in Africa, I'm sure today you got all the information that you need. So we'll see you in Africa soon. Thank you very much.